Hello again. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We have just a couple of minutes before we get started. Just want to make sure that I've got everything set up here before we begin. All right, so we'll begin here at the top of the hour. Welcome everyone. Again, here we are on our third day of our webinar series on ARM and statistics. Here's a couple of housekeeping items before we really get rolling. Give everyone a couple more minutes to connect here. Number one is the chat. So I just put a message in the chat there. That's an excellent place for questions. So as we're going through today, we'll be spending most of our time in the software and showing different features. If you have any questions, if I get moving too fast and we want to take one step back and perform that action again, anything like that, feel free to throw those questions there in the chat. We should also have a little time at the end of this session as well, if you have a more general question or want to wait till the end. The chat works very well for that. So we can utilize that. The other note I have is that we are recording this session. So out on our website, let me bring that over to this monitor here, gdmdata.com. You will find this recording as well as all of the previous ones. In the under the resources heading, we have a page for webinars. So this is where we post all of our upcoming webinars. And then underneath here is the webinar archive. So all the ones we've run in the past, specifically in this webinar series here, will land right here. So you can catch all of the other ones, share the links with others if they want to catch them, or review again what we covered today as well. So those are all out there for anyone who may need them. All right, so with that, we'll begin. I kind of want to start here just looking at the kind of framing today's session. So the very first day we had last week, we had this PowerPoint slideshow, just kind of talking overall in general about statistics and kind of how ARM fits into that. And so then the next day we focused in on the step called data confirmation. And that was really all about taking the data that you've recorded and making sure that what you've recorded is accurate. So trying to find outliers, looking for any strange side effects, bias that could have been introduced, things like that. And that was last week, Tuesday, the second session we had. So once you know that the data that you've typed in is correct in that regards, then that next step would be the data review, really preparing the data to be analyzed in a report. And really the biggest hurdle, the biggest thing that we're preparing for is dealing with the assumptions of ANOVA. So we had, there's kind of a short list of these assumptions here, and we had went over them in the first day. The big ones being the homogeneity of variance and normally distributed data are kind of the two big ones that there's some statistical tests that we have and we have available in ARM that we'll use today to determine if your assessment it can be analyzed with ANOVA. And that's really the goal here is that we want to use the ANOVA to analyze the data, but we can't trust the results if our data doesn't fit some of these assumptions of ANOVA. And so homogeneity of variance, again, was really looking at the variance among treatments in your assessment. And they don't have to be identical, but they need to be similar. So if you have one treatment that was much more variable than the others, or conversely, much less variable and much more consistent across replicates than all of the other ones, then that causes problems in the ANOVA analysis. So we test for homogeneity of variance. We're hoping that the variances are mostly similar, and we'll use the Levine's, or you could use Bartlett's, but we typically use Levine's test for that. And then the other big one we focus on is having the data be, approximately normally distributed, and that's your classic bell-shaped curve. Most of the data points kind of centering around the mean, with a few on the outskirts. And so skewness, kurtosis are common ones that are used there. The Shapiro-Wilks is a statistical test that we'll also utilize in ARM today. We had mentioned there are two other ones in the list of the assumptions of AOV, independence of errors and additivity of treatment effects. Those aren't quite as cut and dried from a here, run this statistical test and it'll tell you yes or no approach. So we had talked about a little bit of what you can do in the data confirmation step to try to catch some of those things, but a lot of that is just kind of the SOPs when you're taking the data to not introduce bias and things like that is really where you can control those items. So we won't spend much time on those two today. It's really the first two that we'll focus in on. And then, of course, we talked about the main options for what you can do if you don't have data that fits those assumptions right off the bat. There are some things you can do, and so we'll look at the data correction transformations, spatial models, and non-parametric statistics are all kind of the items in our toolbox that we can use. And so we'll do this all within ARM. So I have a trial open here. It's just got some example data. I actually just pulled this from our tutorial list. It was a seed treatment study. Just kind of, I had opened up the tutorial study list and just went down various trials until I found one with enough data columns with some interesting things going on. Kind of hard to just make up data, and didn't really want to just kind of make up things to present. So hopefully this has at least some relevancy in the real world at some point in time. But again, mostly just to demonstrate the features. So on the assessment data editor, really what we're going to focus on is the column diagnostics pane. So all the way to the right-hand side, by default, you might see your properties panel. That is typically displayed by default, depending on your options. But there is a column diagnostics panel that's typically minimized initially. And if you just click on the words column diagnostic, and then you press this pin button, that will make this panel stick to the screen instead of just disappearing on you when you click away. And we were here for just a little bit of time in our last session with the data confirmation, but we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it. And so here we're back. And again, this is really specific to the data column that you're clicked into. So here my cursor is living in column number 1 right now. So the first assessment that we took, it looks like we were counting just a stand count of the number of plants that were present at this point in time in the study. So looking at this panel, it's split up into a couple of different sections. This first one here is the Diagnostics section. And this is really about the only place we looked at last time were the first few rows of this table. They're really kind of column stats that really just described what we had in this data column as far as number of data points, number of unique values in that column, how many are being analyzed, and then kind of giving you an idea of if any were missing or empty, things like that. So that's really that first section there is just those descriptions. Really nice, just to check to see if you missed entering in a value or things like that. Really though, for the data review, we want to come down here to this first row where it says Levine's. And so this is really the heart of the data review here is these next 4 lines correspond to the different statistical tests that we had just looked at in a PowerPoint slide. So we can run the Levine's test for the homogeneity of variance. Then we run a Shapiro-Wilks to test for normality. And then skewness and kurtosis also test for normality of data. The skewness being, how centered the curve is, and then kurtosis is how peaked or flat it is. So in this table, we have p-values are kind of the results of those statistical tests. So a p-value that is small enough, smaller than your alpha significance level, would indicate a failed test, a significant test, which would be bad. That would mean that there is some deviation from our assumptions of AOV if the p-value here is small enough. So we're kind of hoping for larger numbers. We don't want small numbers. So here, looking at most of these, none of them are actually less than 0.05. One's pretty close, but they're all above that. So in this data column, we actually don't have any departures from our AOV assumptions. So that's good news. And so really in this data column, so that's what the rows are here. The columns in this table are the possible actions that we can perform on this data column. And so the first column here is raw. That's referring to the raw data. So these are the results of the tests run on the raw data to see what is occurring. The second column is IID, short for identically and independently distributed. And so that is referring to the residuals. And so we actually, in this analysis, we lean towards using the results of the results of the tests on the residuals. And so this is really where we would want to look to see if we have any departures from those assumptions of AOV. And since we don't have any, then we would recommend clicking this checkbox next to IID to say, this is the action I want to take here for this data column. And so this puts that IID into the ARM action codes field. Really the intent for this design with that IID code is to indicate that you've reviewed this data column and there were no departures from the assumptions of AOV. So, kind of in that case of, well, if there is no action to take, how do I know for sure someone looked at it? That IID is a nice way to kind of stamp that, kind of saying, hey, this has been reviewed and everything checks out fine, is really the design for that. So if I press the next button here in the corner, it's going to move my cursor over to data column 2, and you'll notice this whole panel refreshes. I could also just click in between columns, kind of like we had done on that column properties panel, and you'll see everything gets recalculated, again, just depending on which assessment we are clicked into. So moving to the second data column, we can look again at those residuals here and look at our tests, and we will see that now in this case, the Levene's is failing. So 0.02 is less than our significance level of 5. And so this means that we have some work to do. So we can't trust our AOV analysis yet because we have this issue with our assumptions of AOVs. So the next step would be to move down to the recommendations section here. And so this table here, and this is usually where my eye goes to first when I'm kind of reviewing column by column, is really this recommendations table. So you'll see this has the Levene's, Shapiro-Wilks, skewness, kurtosis, all 4 of those main tests that we're looking to. Then we have a recommendation based on the results of each of those. So kind of looking at this table here, we had saw that Levene's is failing, but the other 3 are not. And so you'll notice that these other 3 all have a recommendation of IID. They're all fine. But here now with Levene's, there is an AL that is being recommended. So that brings us to the first item that we can address here. If we're failing to meet the homogeneity of variance test in this case, first thing to try is see if we have a data correction transformation that we can apply. And those main 3 that are used would be the log transform, square root transform, or the arc sine square root % transformation. And so in this case, the recommendation is AL, so that's the log transform. And the reason here would be to transform that to stabilize the variance. And if we look back in the diagnostics table, you'll see that we go from 0.02 in the residuals to, if we run the automatic log transform, these are the results of those tests now, and we end up with a 0.57 p-value. So that's great. Now we don't have that problem if we were to run the AL. Of course, now we've got a little bit of a downside here. If we do that, it looks like our Shapiro-Wilks will then fail, maybe just barely though, but certainly we might have some more issues to deal with. But at least that would fix the Levene's. The other thing to look at with these recommendations is there is this basis option. So what ARM can do, in addition to just looking at the data points and to say, okay, Levene's is failing out of the gate, but if I were to do an AL, that fixes Levene's, so let's do an AL. There's also some a little bit more brains to that if we look at like your rating type or the rating unit. So if we allow ARM to consider what type of assessment this is, then ARM can kind of adjust its recommendation accordingly. So if I change this to change the recommendation basis to be rating type, then we're telling ARM, now notice this is a count. So the COUDIS, in case no one's familiar with that, that's the count of the disease. And so we're really doing count data. Well, a lot of times for count data, the square root transformation is more commonly used. And so instead of just kind of blindly looking at the numbers and hey, AL works, so let's do that, instead ARM can recommend, well, considering this as count data, the square root is maybe more commonly used. Does that fix our problem of Levene's? And sure enough, it does indeed. And actually, if we kind of compare and look at some of these other tests, we actually don't end up with any failing tests. So that actually really benefited us to choose this AS instead of the AL. So you can do both the rating type and the rating unit. It looks like in both cases, it really does recommend an AS instead. So that can be pretty valuable. There's also, it can also read the ARM action codes field. So if you have a rating limit, you know, for example, there's a P for percent to limit the data between 0 and 100. Now ARM knows this is percentage data, and so it can fine tune the recommendations to be a little bit more specific as well. Here in this case, we'll stick to the count, and ARM recommends that AS. So if we decide this is the route we want to go, you can either click that checkbox for the AS, or you can double click in this row as well. And either way, that's going to apply our recommendation here and puts the AS code into this data column. And really what that AS code does is when you run the analysis, then ARM will take this data column and apply the square root transformation to the data, and then run the rest of the analysis on the transform data instead. So kind of one of the nice things about it is we're not changing any of the raw data. You know, notice none of these data values changed at all. We don't need to create a new data column with that transformation. You know, we could insert a new data column here and do a square root transformation on data column 2, and then we'd have the transform numbers here in the editor. But instead, we'll put all of that into one column. And so just within the reporting process, when we go to analyze, does that action actually perform? And then you get your means, and you get the mean separation test all done on the transform data, which we can now trust the analysis because we have fixed the assumptions of AOV. So that's really the theory there, and there's some caveats and some ways of working with that on the AOV means table report, and that's really our focus tomorrow. Will be on the reporting and some of the options, and how you can kind of customize some of those actions and what ARM does. So we'll dive into the specifics of that tomorrow, but in general, that's really what we're doing when we apply this AS, is we're giving ARM some instructions when it comes to the analysis time. And that's really the goal of this data review in general, is to prepare the data column for analysis and getting ready for it. So right underneath this basis, there is a little tool here for graphing, really to see some diagnostic plots. So if you want to dive in a little bit deeper into some of these proposed actions and see some diagnostic plots on the data in general, you can do that here. There's a control right underneath the basis, and also up here at the top with the diagnostics. So here you can kind of choose depending on what has been chosen. I've chosen AS already, so it's going to graph the AS. And so if let me change this layout to 2 by 2 and press show, it will open a PDF here. And since we have an action chosen, what we are given is a comparison, essentially. So we draw on the left-hand side the residuals. So we see the residual box whisker, a QQ norm plot. If I go down one more page, a spread location, and a histogram. So this is those residuals before we take any data correction action. And so you can kind of look to see what type of issues the data is having. Here we said that's the homogeneity of variance. We see treatment 1 is quite a bit more variable than really any of these other treatments. That is most likely the cause of that failed test for homogeneity of variance. Then on the right-hand side, we draw the very same graphs, but this time with the chosen action code. So the recommended action, we chose AS. Now we can see the results. Are we fixing the problems, or are we causing more problems, or making things worse? And so here you can see probably not quite perfect, but still they're definitely more consistent than before. And we can also reference that p-value to see, yes, we did fix the Levines. The QQ norm plot here, we can compare the difference of what we've done. Really haven't broken anything. We're still within the bounds of our Shapiro-Wilk, so we still have a reasonable belief of normality. Same thing with the skewness here on the spread location, and your histogram still is plenty normal. That can be a nice way to really dive into those proposed options. If I were to clear that option off, let me go back here, and if I change my basis to assessment values, I'm really just trying to get a couple of more options here in this table. So if I wasn't quite sure if maybe that AL is something that was kind of the very first recommendation we saw, I could choose that and then view the graphs. And it keeps popping up here on my other screen, but now we can compare side by side the AL instead. And as we showed, we fixed the Levines, but now we've got some problems with the normality. So you can kind of go back and forth and compare the different options if you want. And that's kind of why we have those graphing in the two sections. You can choose whichever one you want to see. Finally, you can also draw, if you have, when we started out, we had the raw data there. And the difference with this one, oops, sorry, I should choose the IID. This is also a comparison, but because it's not an action, but just with the residuals, you can compare what the raw data versus the residuals look like. So if you have that IID chosen to show graphs, we'll kind of just compare the raw data compared to the analysis looking at the residuals. And so just in general, this utilizing the residuals instead of the raw data is a little bit more modern approach. So if you are familiar or have done some data review with ARM in the past, there was some tools on the column properties panel that we had been in on before. There's also a little engine within the AOV report that can recommend some of these transformations and such. But if you see any differences between those two systems, this one here on the column Diagnostics is kind of our newer development, and it really is focused on the results from the residuals. Again, there's a little bit of the limitation of my knowledge of statistics. I can't dive into the theory of why that is, other than I know that's what Peter, our statistician, had said was his focus here with this new development and on the column Diagnostics was it's a more modern approach that people are utilizing in the industry using those residuals. And there is a question about the residuals, and again, I'm a little bit limited in how well I can explain that, but it's really just looking at the differences between each data point relative to the mean. I can't, again, I don't have a really quick, simple explanation for them outside of that, but it really can shake out a little bit of the noise in the data by going to the residuals. It's kind of just looking at the differences in the data points relative to each other as opposed to just the raw numbers. Hopefully that somewhat covers that topic there, but that's really the reason for utilizing this tool, a lot more features than what we had before, but definitely if you were trying to play around a little bit or opening up a historical trial and suddenly, well, how come things are, recommending something a little bit different here compared to the previous ways of kind of using the data review in ARM, that's probably the first place that I would look at is, well, compare the raw to the residuals. To see those results, because the raw data, that's really the old calculations were basing themselves on. Any data transformation recommendations or things like that in ARM before, that's what it would use. And so now here we're utilizing the residuals instead. So just kind of a word of warning, if nothing else, certainly if you encounter a case like that and you weren't quite sure why, you can feel free to send an email to our support box, and we can dive into that. A lot of those, I know Peter, our statistician, really enjoys getting to dive into some of those types of questions and see what's going on at hand there. So that in general really is how to use this diagnostics panel. And kind of as I hinted at, this is pretty new. It's been in ARM maybe a year, maybe not quite. I think we released it kind of at the end of 2019. Really looking at trying to modernize the data review process here, and hopefully make it pretty easy to use once you've seen it. I think it's complicated enough as is most of statistics that you wouldn't pick it up just without seeing anything prior and just run with it. But hopefully that's really the general flow to reviewing. And like I said, if you go on to the next column, typically where my eyes first go to is this list here in the recommendations, because real quickly I can see IID all the way across. So there's no departures from assumptions of AOV. Everything's great. I can double click on IID to add that code if I want to kind of stamp that as reviewed and go to the next column. I do want to kind of fast forward here to data column 12. So I have another example here of some of the other things that we might need to do in a data column. So this one is a lodging percent rating here. And so looking at our recommendations, we have IID for Levine's, that's not failing at all. But our Shapiro-Wilks does fail. And if we just look across this table at all of our data correction transformations, none of them quite fix the problem. So we're kind of run into a dead end in that regard. So if I just toggle back to our list here, if a data correction transformation doesn't work, none of the options fixes the problem, then the next thing we can look at is spatial models. And to do that here, there is a checkbox at the top here to include spatial models. So this isn't really something you would want to do every single time. It's kind of more of a, okay, our first things that we typically work with didn't work. Maybe let's take a look at what happens with the spatial models. And so now we have a bunch more options here of data, or not data columns, but columns here in this table that correspond to the various spatial models that can be run in ARM. And so there are two types of spatial models in general that we can do. There is trend analysis and nearest neighbor analysis. And so these first two would be a linear spatial trend and a quadratic spatial trend. And then these here ending in N would be the nearest neighbor. And actually, to be honest, I don't recall offhand each one of those, but these actually all do correspond to an ARM action code. So if you're not quite sure what the shorthand is there, I'm looking at the list of action codes, and if I scroll down a little ways, we have a section. First section here that we had seen some of these already before is the ASALAA. Those are those automatic data correction transformations. And we use the term automatic to talk about how we left the raw data alone, and only within the reporting process does the transformation happen. So the transformation itself is going to happen automatically later on in the analysis, is essentially what we mean when we say it's an automatic transformation. So here are the spatial models. So you can see the terms there that are being used, the linear, quadratic. There's also a cubic spatial trend that you can look at as far as the nearest neighbor approach to spatial analysis. There's a nearest row neighbor, nearest column neighbor, nearest row and column neighbor, so looking kind of in both directions, also known as the Papadakis, and then nearest row neighbor and column neighbor. I won't dive too deep into the specifics of those. In general, though, a spatial model, you want to look at that only if your blocking fails. So if there's an unexpected gradient, or the blocking that you did perform does not capture what it was supposed to, spatial, using a spatial model then essentially scraps the design of that blocking and just looks at the values in the field to try to find some sort of trend spatially to be able to account for the variance there. So again, not used every time, definitely not something you want to consider with every data column. And if you're not totally comfortable with it, it might be a good thing to lean on your statistician and ask, when's an appropriate time, or if you aren't able to make use of any of those other tools that you've got there for the data review, maybe then kind of play around with this and along with the statistician and get some guidance on if it's a good idea or not in the trial that you're looking at. But the number one thing to consider before even really choosing the spatial model or let ARM recommend a spatial model is to make sure your trial map is right. So looking at that trial map, you want to make sure that, number one, your randomization, so if I color by treatment, you want to make sure, of course, that the randomization is accurate. But if you use the show true scale option in the options tab, you want to make sure that you have the plot dimensions, the buffer size, all of that accurate. And most of that is in the settings here on the layout tab. You can define how much space is in between each block, how much space is in between each plot, different alleys and such, so that the spatial calculations are accurate. So it will use all of those dimensions that are used to kind of draw out this map. Those are all used in the spatial calculations. So you want to make sure it's accurate. If you're not certain if it's accurate or not, or it probably isn't totally, then you definitely don't want to use the spatial because it will obviously not be of any value, won't be accurate. And of course, ARM doesn't really have a way to know whether the map is accurate or not. It will just use what has been filled in. But utilizing the column diagnostics with the linear models are very similar to the data correction. So if we have determined that it's appropriate to try to find a spatial model, we'll really do the same process here. You can look at these different columns in the diagnostics panel there to see if they resolve any of the issues. So specifically, we were looking at Shapiro-Wilks, and it looks like the quadratic will fix that problem. Really, none of the other ones do. So maybe the quadratic would be would be worth considering. The Levine's is better there. But the other thing to consider too with any of those spatial models, if we go down a little bit lower here, there are some specific values here made for the spatial models. And really the AIC and the BIC are two values for deciding whether the spatial model helps or how good it explains the data. And so if I look at that recommendations section here, looking at the AIC and looking at the BIC, your NCN is recommended based on those parameters that spatial model improves that statistic for how well things are explaining. Your model explains the data compared to the design model. Essentially, we're comparing the raw data, your blocking design compared to the, I think the NCN was nearest column neighbor model. So again, it's a little bit trickier here with the spatial models. There's a little bit more to consider, a little bit more to try to balance. You know, there's not just one value. You know, is the p-value low or high? Yes or no? You know, there's more to consider there. And to be honest, it's a little bit over my head as far as how to balance all of that. So that might be a good cue to find a statistician for making some of these choices. But ARM is trying to at least weed, if nothing else, weed out some of the other options and say, well, according to this, the nearest column neighbor is recommended here based on those parameters. So should I run that or not? Really, all four of these rows here are designed really specific to your spatial models. So that one is not for the faint of heart, to be honest. That one's pretty hard. I think might be a good future webinar if there's a lot of interest in that for a really statistically advanced group there. And for sure, I would need Peter to come in and help with that too, because that's about all that my expertise takes me to is that conversation. So. All right, coming back to column 12, let me just refresh the data here. Leaving the spatial models behind, our third option that I wanted to talk about was the non-parametric statistics. And there was kind of a couple questions there that wasn't trying to ignore, but I knew we kind of get over in this general area. So I just kind of wanted to wait until we got over here to make sure to try to address some of those questions. But one last time on this slide here is our non-parametric statistics. And really what we're doing here is we're giving up on the mean and the standard deviation. We're just totally saying, let's not even run the AOV analysis. We have something else that we can run instead, which would be a non-parametric statistics. And you really take the data points and you rank the data points instead. And now you can still create a mean of those ranks per treatment, and then you can run a mean separation on those ranks and still have a similar output in the end of trying to find separation between the treatments. But now we're leveraging and utilizing ranks. Really means a little bit more about your median than it does the mean, is really what it boils down to. And so that option within ARM to run non-parametric statistics is the AR action code. And so you see that in the recommendations here because the available transformations do not improve normality. So that Shapiro-Wilks, again, anything we threw at it from a data correction standpoint still didn't pass the test. So kind of the next thing to do then, if nothing works, is, well, let's just pivot and use non-parametric statistics instead. So if I double click on that, we'll turn on the AR. And so Just like the data correction transformations, we're not changing the data itself. We leave the data intact, and we leave it be, and then only in the analysis does anything change internally in memory when we turn on the AR. So essentially what we'll do, instead of performing a square root, for example, a square root transformation on each data point, for this column with the AR, we will rank the data. And so you'll get either the Kruskal-Wallis or the Friedman's ranking system. So there's kind of couple different ways you can rank the data. And really the choice as to which one you get is chosen by ARM based on your study design. So in your design settings here in the trial, if you're using RCB, then that you get the Friedman's. That's the non-parametric test, or for ranking the data. It's the Friedman's method is used when you have an RCB design. If you're using the CRD, the completely random design, then you'll get the Kruskal-Wallis test. So the Kruskal-Wallis method, I should say, for ranking the data. Pretty much everything else, so if you're using a lattice, if you're using one of the multi-factor designs, then you get an aligned rank Kruskal-Wallis. Essentially, there's some adjustments that are made initially to account for that different blocking scheme, and then it runs the Kruskal-Wallis, is essentially what that does. So if you're familiar with any of those terms in kind of the non-parametric world, ARM will make that choice for you based on your study design. If you do want to override that, so I'm going to open up that action codes, you can actually override that choice if you want. So if you want to force the analysis to be the aligned rank, then use the ART code instead of AR. And similarly, if you want Kruskal-Wallis, you know that's what you want in this data column, then instead of AR, choose KW. It'll still do the same actions in the analysis portion, as far as it's going to leave the data alone until you get there, and then it's going to perform that transformation, if you will, in this case, running the non-parametric statistics. It'll do all of that. This is just kind of a way for you to choose specifically what you want if the general choice you don't want. So again, this AR here, it's being recommended because none of the data correction transformations really fixes the Shapiro-Wilks issue, where we really don't fix the problems of normality. And you can see skewness is fine, it doesn't fail, but kurtosis is also failing in the residuals, and then all of those data correction, none of them fix the problem with kurtosis either. So we really kind of have two reasons to run the AR. One of the questions was about Brown-Forsyth being an alternative to the Levines. And that one, I would probably have to look up to see if that's included at all. The term sounds a little familiar, but it might just be that I've heard that question before. Not necessarily that we're leveraging it in ARM. But essentially the question is, within the non-parametric realm, the equivalent to the Levine's test would be the Brown-Forsyth test. So that's using the median to try to see if there's homogeneity variance, I think. And so I don't know that we have a specific option to run that, but I'd have to do a little checking to see if that's in there or not. I guess one more point just to wrap up the non-parametric stats. I mentioned it briefly, but you still will run the AOV table report, just like we do for all of the data columns. This column number 12 will appear just like any of the other data columns, and really the difference will be in what gets reported. So instead of treatment means and the mean separation on those treatment means, instead those will technically be rank means. So we rank these data points according to Kruskal-Wallis or Friedman's, and then we still can get treatment means based on those ranks. So their rank means per treatment, and then we'll run a mean separation test on those. I think the only difference is running the mean separation on those ranks. We just offer LSD or HSD. So we had all of those other options for running mean comparison tests. We talked about day one. Here, just within the non-parametric tests, that those will kind of shrink down the list just down to LSD or HSD is all we have at this point in time. I think it's fairly common for that one, for the non-parametric, for those to be available and used. So a good question here that was asked, kind of relating to how some of these choices appear in ST. So those of you that might be familiar with summary across trials, that is the add-in to ARM for taking more than one data trial together and combining them. Whether it's across different years, if you run the same study multiple years, or maybe you're running an experiment across 10 different trials. ST allows you to take multiple trials and pool them together and get a multi-trial analysis. Whereas here in ARM, we're really just focused on just this trial. And so these action codes, the action code itself is only performed in the analysis. So it's not going to affect ST in the fact that you'll have transformed data that would be combined. We would be combining the raw data and really thinking of the assumptions of AOV. It's a little bit different with ST then, because you're not really trying to test those assumptions in just one trial, but you're really going to combine all that data first. And so, there's just a little bit, it's a little bit different checklist, really thinking about, how you would want to combine the trials and do that analysis there in ST. But yeah, really, if you want to combine all of those trials, or all of those columns in ST, it might be wise to use the same transformation. And thinking back to, if we go back to that data column number, so data column number 2, yeah, I have IID on there, but I should have AL is what we wanted to turn on. That was the recommendation. That's one where it is a trickier question in ST. Here we chose AL because we had to in the recommendations, and actually then when we considered the rating type, we should really choose AS. But yeah, whether you go into each trial then and use that square root transformation, maybe that's a little gap in my statistical knowledge of kind of the best practices there. But yeah, I think you do want to be consistent. So if you're gonna do a multi-trial analysis, you should decide at the outset if we're counting disease and it's going to be a rare, it's a rare event type of thing, and the square root is a common transformation, then yeah, maybe out of the gate before you even see any data, just put AS on all of them. I think that would be wise to do it consistently, and it's just a matter of choosing which route you want to take. But you should be consistent for sure, looking at that multi-trial analysis. hopefully that helps. Those are some really great questions. And actually, I just want to close out these other columns. I don't think we have any outliers. So we spent some time on the outlier calculation last session. Really at that point in time, we were really just looking for strange values that we should, review and make sure we put in correctly. There is kind of another thought about outliers. Really think about this data review. Is there a really extreme values that should be thrown out? And so there is an outlier calculation that's going on here on this engine here, and you can see it with the maximum standard residual here. Really, that is the basis for the outlier calculation on this panel. It's a lot more conservative, as we'd mentioned a little bit last time about finding outliers. And so it's harder to find one, harder to rig up an example. A lot of times in the training, we could just put in a extremely large value, like change 20 to 200, and try to get it to work. But even that doesn't always trigger an outlier. I got really lucky here. Actually, now we did. So that was fortunate. So here you can see if there is an outlier calculated, there'll be another section up here on the panel. So if I toggle from 15, there's no outliers here, but now in this data column where we have an outlier, there'll be this separate section that lists out which plots are calculated as outliers. And so when I click in that row, it'll take my cursor right to that data point, and it'll show kind of where that is at. So that assessment column 14 is 200. And really the trick being that maximum standardized residual is the calculation behind the scenes there that determines if it's an outlier or not. The tricky thing with outliers, I think, is that you don't necessarily just want to mark that as damaged. We talked about that a little bit last time too. Just because it's strange doesn't mean it's invalid and you shouldn't include it. So I think you have to be careful with some of those outliers. Here in this case, we obviously faked it, and we know 200 is not even valid because this is moisture content, so we know that's not valid. But you just have to be careful, not just blindly throwing away a value. So that's the outliers calculation. The last tool here on this dialog at the very bottom here is an option to save to R or save to SAS. So all of the calculations and really a lot of the statistical brains within ARM, ARM is actually using the R program to calculate a lot of it. And so here what you can do is actually save, whether you're using RStudio or more of the command line R program, you can actually take all of the code that ARM used to generate the analysis on this diagnostics panel and save that, and you can run it yourself in R. Same thing for SAS. So if you're using SAS, we have the comparable output to be able to take and run in SAS. So that can be really nice if you're familiar with those programs. If you want to just see what is it ARM is doing, and you kind of get a behind the scenes look. If you have your favorite tests you like to run or analysis that you want to run, this can be a nice, jump start to take what ARM has, and you can tweak it all you want in the other program too. So again, this is specific to this column. Right now, it will be column 14, kind of all of this analysis that's been generated here, you'll get when you would export to R, and then you could do that for the next data column that you would want. This export is kind of specific to the data column that we're looking at. There's one question here about this diagnostics panel being available in some of the customizations. So some of the, the large corporate sponsors have their own flavors of ARM. Really, that the choice, whether it's present or not, is per customization. So whether each company has chosen to implement it yet or not, I don't recall offhand which ones have. I would guess probably the majority have not yet. But essentially, you could check just when you open up a trial in one of those customized versions, and you'll have you'll simply just won't see that diagnostics panel if you're in one that doesn't have it. And certainly, if you like this analysis and kind of would like to have that in those versions, I would put in a little side plug to poke your sponsor and just mention that you had seen this diagnostics panel, and if you like it in your trials, in your other trials, to say how come we don't have it here in ours. It would be good feedback for them to hear that that's something that the trialists would like. Typically we present to the sponsors when they're getting ready the next year to make any updates to their versions. We'll present changes that we have done and encourage them to include any or all of them, and it's kind of their choice. I think there's a lot more weight to it when the trialists that they're working with request a feature or to say, hey, how come this isn't in this version? I think that gets noticed probably a little bit more than just GDM talking about GDM stuff. So a little plug for that, if and really that goes for anything in ARM too that you like. If you don't see it in their version, maybe they didn't think it would be as important, and certainly hearing from trialists definitely can change their minds. So. And the last question, sorry, Lisa, I had missed it before. I was going to mention that about excluding the untreated check plots in the review. And that was actually a question I had encountered in a support email a couple of weeks back. And I think we have to review a little bit on this engine, the best way to do that. So in general, excluding like your check plots from a report, there is an action code to do that. It is EC, but I don't believe that is, oh, I still have my goofy 200s. Let me just fix that now. This EC includes those check plots from the analysis when you do the report, but it's not yet being captured in the diagnostics. So right at this moment, there really isn't a simple way to drop out those check plots from the data review. I think that's something though that we'll look at in the future. If there's an option here, or just have ARM kind of acknowledge that EC when we're doing the stats, something like that. But at the moment, there really isn't a way to do that outside of if you really had to. You could, make these all missing, which really would not be ideal, of course, to take out your data. But that would be about the only hack I could think of off the top of my head to make that work until we kind of review that. So. All right. Well, great questions again today. Thank you all for joining us. We're kind of hit the end of the hour. I do have a few more minutes if people did have some more questions. I wouldn't want to cut anyone off. But of course, if people have to get going to another meeting or such, I appreciate everyone joining us today. Again, same time, same place. Tomorrow we'll have our last session in this webinar series, again, kind of looking at the AOV report. We'll talk about obviously just how to generate that and all the little pieces, options, and common support questions we see there. So I'll hang on here for just one more minute if anyone had questions. Otherwise, we'll catch everyone tomorrow. Thanks everyone for joining.